When one is learning to write English, one is usually taught that apostrophes mark contractions. So don't equals do not, aren't, are not, whomst of, whomst would have. But what about apostrophe s? That little s that marks possession. I know the full forms of all the contractions I see intuitively, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't figure out the full form of apostrophe s. So I asked my teacher one day and learned that it is from a historical construction from Middle and Early Modern English of using his to mark possession. So the man, his car, becomes the man's car, the woman, his book, becomes the woman's book, and I just kind of took that as an answer. Time passed and I became interested in linguistics, and fascinated with Proto-Indo-European. At this point, I had completely forgotten about the history to apostrophe s I learned in middle school, and just assumed that the genitive s in English was the last remnant of the Old English and by extension, Germanic case system. Until one day quite recently on my Conlang Discord group, someone brought to my attention the sein genitive used in colloquial German. Intrigued by this construction and its similarity to the construction that was reportedly the origin of genitive s in English, I did a bit more research. And oh boy, is the history of this possessive marker more convoluted than I originally thought. See, in Middle and Early Modern English, there were a few ways to show possession. The most common method was with the genitive s from Old English, often spelled es or ys. Around the 1600s or so, the apostrophe was introduced into Middle English, and it followed the French tradition of marking any elided vowel. So not just in contractions like couldn't, won't, I'll, but also in old multisyllabic suffixes that lost their syllabic quality. Like ed was spelled apostrophe d for loved or walked, and the plural and genitive s were both marked apostrophe s. So question solved, right? Apostrophe s for the genitive is just a remnant of this old system of apostrophe use. Everything else brought back the e or just dropped it entirely. But just that alone might not have been enough to solidify apostrophe s in English. There was another thing that helped preserve this old practice, and I mentioned it earlier. This other thing was the his genitive. The his genitive was a construct similar to French de, where it would be placed after the possessor and before the possessed noun. So the man his car and the woman his bread. This construct gained some popularity during the time the apostrophe was being used to mark any elided vowel, so it's pretty easy to see what happened. The apostrophe s for genitive was mistaken as a contraction for the his genitive, reinforcing the apostrophic use while all the other non-contraction type apostrophes were lost. Not long after these developments, prescriptive grammar started to take a hold in England around the 1700s, so the apostrophe s usage stuck. And that's where I would end the story if I didn't grow curious about the origin of the his construction in English, and its relation to the sein construction in other Germanic languages. See, around the 1250s was when the first recorded use of the his genitive appeared in English. Up till this point, the only type of genitives in English were the casal genitive and the of genitive. Low German, a closely related language to English, also developed a his genitive, which then spread to colloquial Dutch and German when those languages became standard. So similar constructions arising at the same time between English and its closest relatives. Seems like a pretty open and shut case, no? Except there were some key differences between how the his genitive functioned in Middle English and Low German. In Low German, the possessor would be placed in the genitive or later on in the dative, and the possessive pronoun would agree in gender with the possessor. The same thing could be seen in German and Dutch, and it functions similarly in Early Modern English as well, where the possessive pronoun would change to match the gender of the possessor. Now, while this has always been the case in German, Dutch, and Low German, in Middle English, the possessive pronoun didn't actually agree in gender. It was only found in the invariable his form. So linguists decided to reanalyze the his genitive, and here's the kicker, believe it might be an old spelling mistake akin to could've instead of could've, or your instead of your. See, after the collapse of gender in Old English, Middle English marked most genitives with is, ys, or es. Spelling back then was much more inconsistent. But these endings were identical to variants of the word his. So in writing, people began to misunderstand the genitive ending as the pronoun his. And so people started to use them interchangeably in writing. but we don't know for certain if the his genitive was actually used in spoken English, as there were no voice recordings back then. So to recap, the genitive s split in Middle English to the original es and the spelling mistake of his. The e was replaced with an apostrophe to mark an elided vowel. The his genitive was then somewhat mistaken as the full form and reinforced the use of apostrophe in the genitive despite it being dropped from other elided vowels. The his genitive then promptly falls out of use by the 1800s, leaving us with just the apostrophe s. Language is weird.